To all of you who are watching, not only in our community, but across the country, we want to wish you the happiest of Sabbaths. We're back. Last weekend, we were off as we celebrated with our university the Alumni weekend. And so you were able, if you tuned in, to hear some amazing stories of what God is doing through our alumni in different places of the world. But today, Joey and I are back to simply invite you to dwell with us in the Word as we think about finances like we've been doing all quarter long. But now we think of finances with an eye towards the future. So before we do that, we're going to have a moment just to invite you to pray with us and ask for God's provision over our conversation. Father, we are so thankful because you ultimately provide hope, and hope allows us for the possibility of planning ahead, of planning a future. And regardless of the number of zeros in our bank accounts, we simply would pray that you give us the certainty that you are going to be part of our future, regardless of what happens. We want to remember, Lord, so many things that are happening in our world. We want to remember and pray for people in our community who, again, are facing a storm this weekend. We just pray, Lord, that you keep them safe. We also, Lord, would pray for all of the alumni that have left this past weekend, that they may have gotten home safely. And Father, we pray for that helicopter and our missions team in the Philippines, and how devastating the not knowing might be, Lord. We just pray that your peace and your comfort be with the families. We pray for us as we converse. We do so thinking about the future, a future with you. Amen. Joey, long, busy weekend last weekend. What was your favorite part? Was it the haystacks?
The haystacks were pretty good, but my favorite part was just reconnecting with so many people, people who had been here in Loma Linda, people that I had gone to school with at Pacific Union College. Also, I got to meet some of my old professors as well who were coming down to visit and to connect with people. Dr. Hammerlin, Dr. Taylor. It was just really good to see all those people again and just have great conversations.
It was a fantastic week. It was with fantastic music.
Yeah.
Which I think that was my favorite part. It's just the music was excellent. And then it was really inspiring. I really enjoyed Dr. Hart and his presentation during our time slot on what God is doing with people. We had the story of a nurse who, and if you watched, you might remember, who had a child. The child was on the spectrum and he was being bullied, and it was a difficult go for him at school. And this love of a parent invites or causes this mother to become an advocate, and now there's 22 children in a school that she has started for people that are on the spectrum. So that was amazing. Wow. And then the other thing that was really neat was to see how invested this university and this family is in the community. And so I love the fact that some of our Gateway graduates were highlighted, and the fact that we made a point of just noting what they're doing in kind of disenfranchised and underserved sections here in Southern California, and how they're that ultimate bridge between healthcare and the communities that we try to serve. So it was truly a high weekend, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It's nice getting together in weekends like these, just to realize that as a church we have ministries that we're doing, but we are a part of a larger picture and a larger community, and it's just amazing to see what God is doing through the work of Loma Linda at large. And so that's always very powerful.
Yeah, and I think that is a perfect segue to our conversation today, because as I was sitting in the pews this weekend, there were two thoughts that kept running through my head. And the first one, obviously, was the providential care that God has given us in this place and in this time. I mean, you look around and it was just so moving to see a church full of alumni that is invested in service. And then I started thinking of all the generations of alumni that have gone out and invested themselves in service, and how that was possible through a vision and through a dream that Ellen White had when she came here, and this was nothing but orange groves.
Yeah.
And so I think savvy planning, thoughtful planning for the future, kind of linking to what some of the lesson was talking about, really is giving a great harvest for the kingdom in terms of service. The other thing that I constantly talked about was throughout the service, we all know that the costs of healthcare in California have skyrocketed. We know that at least our institution is constantly trying to balance this call to be mission-oriented and mission-minded with the financial realities of the marketplace. And what I found so fascinating is I did not hear a single long-winded statement on how we need your money. Now, there was money that was picked up from our alumnus, but it was for Worthy Student Fund. It was to continue this tradition of service and mission. And so that also kept running through my mind, not only as I connected it with the lesson, but as I thought about what this place really is about. It's a place that is investing in the future. And for us, the best return on investment is service.
Yeah, and that's the powerful point that the lesson does focus on, is we think with the future in mind, but we don't think with fear and anxiety, right? We look forward with expectation of opportunity of what God can do through us and for us in the future.
Yeah, that's the point that continued kind of to echo as I read through the lesson. It was kind of this notion that yes, it is wise, and I mean, the whole of wisdom literature is written on this idea that it is wise to plan for the future, but it's also ultimately a planning and a process that is devoid of fear. It's not only devoid of fear, but it is full of trust. And so if there's a collapse in the market tomorrow and our retirement funds disappear, then we're not afraid. We know that God is ultimately going to look out after us. And so there's always that tension, right, between the planning and between the giving ourselves over in trust that the Lord will provide.
Yeah. I think that's something that the author has done a good job of, because there is a fine line between planning and hoarding, right? There is that line between those, and he does make that clear that yes, we are expected to plan for the future and make sure that, to ensure that there are funds to take care of us in retirement. We're not saying open up all your retirement accounts, don't go in debt, right? Don't rack up credit card bills in order to do God's work. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about having good financial principles, but at the same time, don't let the worry and fear over the future keep us from partnering with God in doing the good that He's doing around us right now. And so there is that line that he walks very gently, and I think he does a good job of.
Yeah, likewise, Joey. That I think was one of the things that again stuck with me. The other thing I think that stuck with me, and just trying to delve a little bit deeper into kind of not just some financial principles, but some theological principles that we can adopt and that can help us and aid us as we plan for the future and as we decide how we're going to allocate our resources, is the fact that often I think this desire for hoarding comes from a misunderstanding, a deep-seated misunderstanding of the gospel. And let me kind of expand on that. We all know, I think, intellectually that ultimately death is the great equalizer. Right? It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter how much wealth you accumulate. Death is the ultimate equalizer. And intellectually, that makes sense. It makes sense to the point that, as you know, there's several billionaires have gotten together and made a commitment, a pledge, to donate to charity the vast majority of their fortunes when they pass. So intellectually, we understand this idea that at some point, death remains the great equalizer. The problem isn't that we don't understand that. The problem is that often, because we are unsure, we tend to avoid conversations about death. So people can know intellectually that their time on this earth is coming to an end, and yet they can still be compelled to hoard because we always think that we have more time.
Yeah.
And I think we're pushed to think in those ways because we're afraid of what lies on the other side. And I think the only way that we can become more oriented practically to this intellectual understanding that we have, that we can't take anything with us, is if we stop looking at death with fear. And the only way we do that is we've got to understand the gospel.
Yeah.
And the gospel says perfect love casts out all fear. And so when we think about kind of end of life decisions, those are conversations that we ought not to be afraid to have. Those are conversations that we ought to welcome because we have understood the gospel.
Yeah. And you're exactly right. There is a lot of fear surrounding those kinds of conversations. Almost, we try not to think of ourselves as being superstitious because we're Christian, right? But there's almost a superstition. Like if we talk about death, are we inviting death in? The reality is that death is coming no matter whether we talk about it or not, right? I think it's Benjamin Franklin that first said, the only certainties in life are death and taxes, right? So yes, we know death is coming just as we know April 15 is coming. Right. So we know that death is coming for us. The question is, are we going to be ready for it? And that's really the question that Jesus is asking in Luke chapter 12, in the parable of Luke chapter 12, right? He's saying, this fool, he planned for everything except for his own death, right? And so those conversations that you're talking about, I do think are so important. The conversations that we have about the end of life care, what we want the end of our lives to look like, how we want the resources that God blessed us with, how we want that to be used. All of those conversations, I recently had those conversations with my parents, and instead of being something that was, of course it's sad to think of them being gone, but it actually was something that opened up a part of their lives and their hearts to me, to see what they really cared about in their lives and what they want. That was actually something that was a blessing for me, for my sister, for us to have those conversations with our parents. So I don't think those are conversations, I understand why they're uncomfortable, but I don't think those are conversations we should be afraid to have, because God does call us to plan for the future.
Yeah. And I think, again, like you're saying, the fear comes, I think, from a focus on mortality that is not quite in line with kind of how Jesus sees death. So I was thinking this week as I read the lesson, man, wouldn't it be nice if we could reframe the conversation surrounding death and the planning of our assets and end-of-life care and medical directives and all the other things that need to happen? And I realized, or I said to myself, one of the things that we can do is to simply continue pushing this message that we often talk about when we are invited to hold space for people who are in those last steps of their journey on this life. And that is, we tell them, look, God can heal you. The beauty of this moment is that the resurrection is coming. And healing is coming. It's just a matter of time. It can be today, right now, and God can, or you can die, and then the next thing you know, it's the second coming for those who die is here. And that's, I think, why the gospel says, blessed are those who rest in the Lord, right? It has to do with this idea that, yes, death for those of us who are left here is painful, and there's definitely some separation and some sadness. But for those of us who are on that journey, it is, I think, reframing it and thinking, man, this is the second coming. And it is the opportunity for God to have everything that he has planned for my life fulfilled. That, I think, is a way in which the conversation, at least, isn't so fraught with tension and fear.
Yeah, I love how you said that. That healing is coming. It's just a matter of time, right? It's just a matter of when. And really, all the healings that we get here on earth are just temporary until the final healing of when Jesus comes, right? That's the only healing that will never end. And so that's something that we can look forward to. And there is a tendency, especially in pop culture, to frame death as the ultimate evil, right? Like death is the ultimate evil that you want to try to postpone and keep away from as much as possible. And that makes sense if you're not thinking that there is something beyond death. But as Christians, we know that death by itself is not the ultimate evil, right? Separation from God is, right? And as long as we are with God, death is just a temporary state that we just await for something better.
That's so well said, Joey. And when you start looking at it like that, then you're thinking to yourself, what are practically the benefits of having these conversations without the fear and without the tension that sometimes the conversations, by their very nature, since they are sensitive, imply. And you mentioned one. You said, well, one of the really neat things of having these conversations, and my mother-in-law has been a trust officer for many years and now is a director of trust services at our conference. So we talk about this a lot. And one of the things that it does is it does allow you to get an insight into the priorities that the people that you love have. It also forces you to prioritize. When you're thinking about kind of what I want done, with not only my financially, but with medical decisions and power of attorney and et cetera, it does force me to define what my priorities are, which I think tells me, even at 40, I've got plans to be around for many, many more decades. But even as I've had those conversations now, it has forced me to start thinking about the things that I prioritize. So that, I think, is a benefit. The other benefit is it allows you to have some sort of volition and voice over what happens in the future. And it turns down the pressure for those whom you love that these decisions are already made and they're made by you. So I think those just off the top of my head, as I was thinking about kind of this topic, I said, well, there are some real benefits that you can have to having these conversations at any season in life when you're not having them in a space of fear.
That's such a great point about turning down the pressure, because I have been in so many spaces where the question is, what would that person have wanted? And the reality is, as well as we know each other, there's no way to know for sure. And that angst of that the survivors of loved ones who have passed away deal with, of trying to figure out how to do what the other person would have wanted, their loved one would have wanted, it does create a lot of anxiety. It does create a lot of pressure. And so as much as we can take that pressure off of them by sharing with them, this is what I want. Obviously, we don't want to be unreasonable, but like, this is what I want. Letting people know that actually does help so much.
Yeah, and it does allow for in a moment, you know how crisis is, right? It allows for you to have, as a person who's going through a moment of crisis, it does allow you to be present in the moment of crisis rather than thinking about other things. I've had a healthcare directive since before I had any financial resources, and I really think that the fact that we've, at least Linda and I, have really tried to demythologize death and to have these conversations straightforward. I think that's better preparing us when one of us has to pass on.
That's powerful. And it does show that, as a Christian, that even after we've died, we can serve our loved ones, right?
Yeah.
That's a service that we provide for them. I've even heard of some people who have written letters to their loved ones, just in case they don't ever get a chance to share those final words with their loved ones, that they write them on paper so that as a part of their trust, that their loved ones can hear one final message of love and care and compassion. I think that's
so beautiful. That is so beautiful, and I love the way that you put it. It is the opportunity to extend one last act of love while we're on this earth to those who matter the most to us. So, Joey, you mentioned, and we've talked a little bit about this tension, right? Because I know we're trying to demythologize it, but it's not a pleasant conversation to have. It's a conversation that ultimately is fraught with the reality that those whom we love or ourselves are going to be separated for a time. So there is some difficulty in having the conversation. And there is also kind of the call that we've been talking about to serve, to plan, to prepare. And I think nowhere of all the texts that the lesson pointed to, nowhere was this paradox and this tension better captured than in the parable that you mentioned, which is in Luke chapter 12. Now, the lesson deals with 6 verses, 16 through 22. But what I want to do is I want to go before and I want to go right after, just to capture the full force of the tension that Jesus is trying to set before us. So, Jesus is teaching, and someone kind of pipes up from the crowd in verse 13 and says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." So Jesus is actually, and this is, I think, really refreshing, Joey. Jesus isn't talking about the ills of material wealth. He is talking about material wealth being what guides your ultimate pursuit in life. Paul Tillich, famous 20th century theologian, says that you can learn most about people when you punctuate those issues that are, he calls them issues of ultimate concern. And what Jesus is saying is wealth cannot be that issue of ultimate concern. That's where we get sideways. So to those of us who I've often heard that money is the root of all evils, it doesn't seem like that is really linking up with what Jesus is saying. Jesus's ministry, by the way, was contingent on people that had some sort of financial resources providing from the ministry. But those resources weren't their matters of ultimate concern. And so I think before we talk about finances and about planning and estate planning or any kind of planning, we've got to realize that in the Christian narrative, there isn't a problem with material wealth. There's a problem with the unmitigated pursuit of material wealth.
Yeah, that's a really great point because, like you said, Jesus doesn't say that money is the root of all evil. It's the love of money,
That's
right?
correct.
It's putting money in its improper place and trying to use it to do something that it was never meant to do. It was never meant to provide us ultimate security. It was never meant to be the ultimate pursuit of our lives. It was never meant to be our source of happiness. Money is not those things. But of course, money is necessary to live lives here on earth, right? So I think it's Kanye West who said, it's not money. Having money isn't everything. Not having it is,
Right.
right? And so yes, when
Kanye
you
was, I mean, I can't believe that, because Kanye usually, Joe, you know, Kanye, half the stuff that comes out of his mouth
It's
is
terrible.
nonsensical, but then they'll drop a jewel of wisdom. Yes, I love that.
Yeah,
well
so-
done, Kanye.
So it is yes, not having money. If you don't have enough to survive, obviously there is a need for us to get some. But after that point, and that was interesting. I just recently watched a video about the world. There's a World Happiness Index,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And there's a video out there that says why Finland and Denmark are happier than the United States. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Video? Yeah. Okay. What I found about what was so interesting about that video is they make that exact point in that video that yes, money does. If you don't have enough money to survive, yes, getting money will make you happier. But having money beyond that is not going to extend your happiness. There's a limit to how much happiness or contentment can come from having money.
Yeah.
And ultimately, having too much money actually lends itself to discontentment often, because it becomes an obsession,
Yeah.
right? There are people who have a lot of money that are able to be content and to be happy and not let it rule their lives. But there is a tendency that when we have more and more, that we start to become obsessed with it. So I think what you're saying is so important. It's not money itself that is the problem. It is how we use money, how we see money, and ultimately how we love money. That is.
Oh, that's powerful. Yeah, so I read, because the report, the Happiness Index report, as you know, is, I mean, it's somebody's dissertation somewhere. And they were looking at how much income do you need to have to be considered happy. And it was like $120,000 a year, combined income. I might be wrong on the exact number, but it's around it. I'm just giving you a ballpark figure. And when you think about it, that's not that much. I mean, it's
still a lot
comfortable.
of money,
But it's not that, when you think about a two income family, it's not that much. And what they found was below that, you start having real difficulties. And what you're saying makes absolute sense. When there's food insecurity or housing insecurity, or the inability to provide for your children or education, et cetera, that obviously contributes to a situation at home that is more tense. What I found fascinating, though, as you're mentioning, is that beyond that threshold, your happiness index doesn't deviate that much. Now, can you be a billionaire and be happy? Absolutely, but you're not going to be happier than somebody who's working a middle income job in the developed world. And so I think that what you're saying is really important. It's, yes, you do need to have a job and to have work and to have some security and some stability, but beyond that, money is perhaps one of the most overrated things we have. I love reading. I just read a piece that I couldn't believe. So Warren Buffett, who's right now his gross income is around $108 billion. So that's just a little more than 120K. Warren Buffett lives in the same house, Joey, in Oklahoma, that he did when that's about a 5-minute drive from Berkshire Hathaway. And he bought it for, if you're thinking about the conversion now, for about $335,000, adjusting for inflation, which is, in California, that's not a lot of money to pay for a house right now. The house is valued at $1 million, which sounds like a lot, but when you think about this man being one of the top 10 wealthiest persons on earth, $1 million house, and they asked him, said, Warren, why don't you move? And his response, I think, was so profound. He said, well, this house has served me fine. He's lived there for 60 years. And if I thought I'd be happier anywhere else, I'd move. but I don't feel I'm going to be happier anywhere else, and so I stay. Just so profound, because when we often think about, if I could only have more, I'd be happier. And here this person who has it all says, well, not really.
Wow. And that is a hard thing to do. I mean, I don't know how it popped up, but every once in a while these videos pop up in my YouTube, and maybe it pops up because I actually watch them. But there's this video of a $42 million home in Utah, Park City, Utah. Most expensive home. And
that's because you're going to buy it.
Yeah.
He's been looking. Friends, Joey's been looking.
I'm in the market, so if you know
real estate in Park City. So if 25 million, though, is his limit.
That's my cap. But I was watching the video, and at first it was interesting. Like, what causes it? Like, that's the first question that pops into my, like, what causes it to be 42 million? And after watching a little bit, I understood. I mean, it has like a bowling alley and an indoor like sports court and all these things, right? But then the other thing popped in my mind was anxiety. Like, as I watched it, it wasn't like, oh my goodness, this would be so amazing. It's like, imagine having to clean that home. And then, well, there's no way I could just clean it myself. That would be my full-time job. Then I would have to hire like a full-time staff just to care for the home. Like, how much is that going to cost? And then it was just like, oh my goodness. And yes, like maybe if I had the money, I would do that. But then why would I need all that space? Why would I need, like, maybe if I were throwing galas every night, maybe, or so it was just kind of mind-blowing, this home for me. And so I was thinking to myself, when you were talking about Warren Buffett, I was like, would I actually be happier living in that home than in living in mine? And honestly, no. I mean, wouldn't be happier. Like, it would actually be more stressful thinking about trying to upkeep this home than the home I have right now. And so, yeah. And if somebody out there lives in a $42 million home,
we'd love to go visit you. By the way,
we'd love to go visit you.
Love bowling, and we'll play in your bowling alley. We just won't buy it.
But it does show that there are things that this world seems to set up as being the ultimate things. Like when you don't think of life having a future beyond the 70, 80, 90, whatever years that we live here on earth, there is a tendency to look for meaning in things that are ultimately meaningless. Right? And that's the point that's made in Ecclesiastes over and over again. This man who continued to look for meaning in all of these things, and ultimately his end was, it's all meaningless. Yeah. There is no ultimate meaning in any of this. The only ultimate meaning is found in fearing God, right? And trusting in him, and ultimately he leads you to meaning.
Yeah, think about that, how disheartening that realization must have been, right? The lesson talks about that famous passage in Ecclesiastes where the wise man says, I saw all the works that I had done with my hands. In essence, what he's saying is, I've taken inventory of my whole life, and at the end, I find no joy in it. That is gotta be one of the most disheartening statements that one can make, and yet people make it all the time. You were talking about this enormous home. I get anxiety in my 2,600 square foot home because I don't feel I'm connected enough with what my kids are doing. My kids will be upstairs or in their room. And so I'm thinking, man, we're losing connections here, especially as, my oldest is a preteen now and he wants his own space, and I want to be I'd love, well, maybe not, maybe that's too much, but I was about to say I'd love for us to cut the size of the house in half so that we all have to actually be in earshot of each other. And I think both what the author of Ecclesiastes is saying and what happens to this rich fool is that we've tried, as you so artfully have said, to place meaning in things that are meaningless. And when you do that, there is an internal mechanism, a compass that God has put inside us. As C.S. Lewis so masterfully says, that tells you or that orients you to those things that are, in Tillich's words, of ultimate concern. And when you're not focused on those things, anxiety starts creeping in because your internal compass says, this thing that I'm invested in, this thing that I'm taking inventory on, is not what God has made me for. And so there is, I think, this inherent anxiety. Think about the rich fool, Joey. He had an abundant harvest. That's a joyful occasion. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and then I'll store my surplus gain, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat and drink, and be merry. We talk a lot about in this culture about delayed gratification. Well, I think there are some real benefits to it. What this parable is trying to say is ultimate meaning is found in fearing God and in keeping those whom you love close today, now. And when you do that, all of this anxiety, if you have enough, and we kind of talked about the importance of kind of having some sort of security, but when you get there, the anxiety disappears because now your internal compass is connected to the will of God.
Yeah. And that's what I loved about the quote the Ellen White quote that the author led with. If you read that quote in context and testimonies, what she's talking about are people who are so worried about not having enough that they are like being stingy with how they're spending on themselves, how they're spending on their children, how they're giving to the community. It's like you're living in abject poverty because you're worried about the money, right? And she's saying, if you trust your children to care for you, to use that money to care for you well so that you can have a good life here, right? And not live in abject poverty. That's something I didn't actually realize that Ellen White had talked about, that she had talked about the importance that as you age, just to allow to enjoy some of the fruits of your labors, that it's not a bad thing to actually enjoy life a little bit, and to not be so worried about the money that we have to be so stingy with ourselves and with others, to be more free and generous with others and with ourselves.
And that's why I think as we conclude our conversation, we go back to the words of Jesus, because I think Ellen White, and as she was saying it, as I read that quote, I said, why didn't the lesson kind of continue with chapter 12? Because that's exactly, I was thinking, that's exactly the spirit of what Jesus says right after this parable. He says, don't worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, about what you will wear. Life is more than food, body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. And we know this, right? They do not sow, they do not harvest. Look at the wildflowers in the field. But then he gives us this jewel that really encapsulates what Sister White was talking about in verse 32. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. But notice what he says right after. Provide purses for yourselves. So it doesn't say, like we were talking at the beginning, go into credit card debt to help the poor. It says provide purses for yourself that will not wear out. Be intelligent, be wise with how you're investing your own resources, and a treasure in heaven that will never fail. Focus on that which is, be wise, focus on that which is of ultimate concern, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Yeah. So there's kind of this two-pronged tension where Jesus is telling his followers, be wise, be smart, be careful, don't worry, and focus on that which really matters.
Yeah. Yeah, that tension is always going to be in place, because I've seen some people who have, poured out everything to the point where they are left with nothing. And it then becomes a burden on for themselves, for their family members, their loved ones, for the state, right? On the other hand, there's some people that are so miserly that they they do themselves and others a disservice with the resources that God is. So it is a tension, right? That we have to. But what the principle that Jesus gives to guide that tension is this verse 31 and verse 34. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well, right? So this idea that what guides us is this future-minded approach that ultimately we want to make sure that we make wise use of the resources that God has given us to care for ourselves and to care for others, because ultimately what we're waiting for is the ultimate deliverance, the ultimate healing, like you said, when Jesus returns.
Yeah. And so the tension then is resolved by providing purses for yourself that will not wear out, but also by putting the kingdom of heaven in the first place. That is, I think, a really astute way of looking not only at finances, but at relationships, at connections, at friendships, at our jobs, at anything that we have. Pour into those relationships, but keep those things of ultimate concern always present. Joey, thank you for leading us. Let's have a word of prayer as we conclude today's conversation on planning for the future.
Yes, let's pray. Our good and gracious God, we want to thank you so much for being a God who steps into these difficult spaces, these spaces that sometimes we're afraid to step into because we're worried about where the conversations will lead. And yet you tell us that we do not have to be afraid of what the future holds, because you hold the future in your hands. And so with that confidence in your ability to care for us, we ask that you give us the courage to have conversations about the future with our family members, to have those difficult conversations about end-of-life decisions, about how we want the resources that we have to be used, how we want our end of life to be cared for, how we want our loved ones to respond, and for us to be able to minister to them, and then also to live our lives with that future in mind, intentionally not making more of money than it was intended to be, but not also making less of it either. Lord, guide us as we make those wise decisions today, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
So our dear friends, this week, our prayer for you is simply that, as my colleague said, that you be wise, and that wise action leads you to kindness, and that kindness leads you to have just a glimpse, a brief glimpse of what the kingdom of heaven is. May you store your treasures there, now and always. We'll see you next week.